and everyone here a quick synopsis of what we mean and what we fight when it comes to fake news or misinformation or disinformation. There are some technical differences, but I think the word fake news or misinformation will broadly suffice. And the reason I'm giving you this overview is not because you don't know anything. Everyone who's listening here will know exactly what this is about, but wrapping it in a certain context perhaps helps understand things, and also the factors that are at play, because of which perhaps the problem is maybe bigger than what it used to be and is becoming bigger, as many would argue. So the challenge of misinformation, or the phenomenon of misinformation, is not very old. The way it really goes back to late 2016. And as you know, late 2016 is exactly 4 years ago from this date, when we had the US presidential elections, and Donald Trump was fighting with Hillary Clinton, and the elections that he won. Most of you also know that misinformation was seen as having played a role in determining the course of that election. And while the term fake news was not so commonly used, it became very clear in retrospect that fake news had played a role. Now, the manner of dissemination of that news was actually quite fascinating. There were websites that were being run, created and run out of Eastern Europe in countries like Macedonia, which were essentially publishing blatantly false information. Even the word news is not technically correct. So for instance, a website would say Hillary Clinton is a witch, and here is proof for that. Or Donald Trump was blessed by the Pope to become president of the United States, and a very serious and very believable looking website and page and photographs and so on. That page or that piece of news would get picked up by Facebook, and then using algorithms developed and sharpened by organizations like, or rather specifically Cambridge Analytica, this was targeted at people who were essentially willing recipients of this kind of information. And amazingly, I see the same phenomenon at work. Even most recently, when I was watching some of the campaign rallies and the themes that were being discussed, and when people were interviewing those attending some of those rallies, and they would be asked, so why are you voting for this person, or why are you not voting for the other person? They would say stuff which was essentially either highly misleading or completely outright fake, but clearly something that they had received and they had been served, and therefore they had made up their mind that this was misinformation. This was true. So this was what happened in 2016, and like I said, there's already a rerun happening in some ways. But more than that, as 2016 went into 2017, it became clear that technology was playing a very critical role in the distribution, dissemination, and targeting of misinformation. So one is the creation, which was happening on websites in Eastern Europe. The other was the distribution and the targeting, which was happening at scale. We're talking about tens of millions of people receiving information, which was in a way predetermined, because the technology allowed people to know what was the psychographic or the social profile of the person who would be the best recipient for a certain kind of, or a certain leaning piece of news or information, and most likely in this case fake. So as we went into 2017 and 18, one is it became clear that there was a new phenomenon at work. The second thing it became evident was that this was a phenomenon that's maybe started in the United States, but then started spreading all over the world, or it maybe simultaneously caught on in different parts of the world. So why did that happen? One is, I think, the nature of governments and the nature of people driving those governments changed, and social media and targeting became an integral part of strategy. And so to be used for good, to propagate a certain party line or a party proposition, but also began to be used by various people, may not be the parties themselves or the governments themselves, but by definitely people allied to them, for furthering or using misinformation, and more as a strategy now, rather than just as a response to something. So this became, this started growing 2017 into 18. The one thing that also changed significantly in countries, in some countries, and most significantly in a country like India, was the advent of Jio. So Jio, as you know, took the mobile phone penetration in India from maybe about 200 million or so to about 500 million or so, which is what we have today. So as you also know, mobile phone equals internet equals WhatsApp. So at one shot, or maybe not exactly one shot, but over a couple of years, you really almost doubled or more than doubled the amount of people who were accessing the internet, who were digitally not so literate. There is a distinction, which I'm sure you know now, between literacy and digital literacy. So you had hundreds of millions of people who were not so digitally literate, who were consuming and connected with the internet for the first time via their smartphones and WhatsApp, and receiving information and misinformation which could not be verified, because by nature these platforms were end-to-end encrypted. So no one could peer in to see what was happening. That was another subtle shift that happened in India in the 2017-18 period. We saw Facebook, for instance, playing a greater role in sourcing or pushing out, not the platform itself, but the people on the platform disseminating misinformation. By early 18 into 19, it had all shifted into WhatsApp largely. So that's really the quick genesis of misinformation, as you call it. The supply of misinformation has been growing steadily. So earlier it was believed that this would be largely used for political reasons and would coincide, or the spurts or the bursts would coincide with political events like elections, including legislative elections. But it also became clear over the last couple of years that any event, it could be Pulwama, it could be COVID-19, it could be floods in Kerala, could be used by people who were obviously had a stake in creating some kind of fissure in society to use either the event or events surrounding the event to create some kind of divisive content aimed usually at some communities or sometimes at one community, and really keeping the whole cycle going, so to speak. So the objective of this may not be to achieve any one particular outcome in a particular time, but to over time to keep pushing a certain narrative and using fake news as the vehicle to do that. So this is really the manner in which it's grown. And like I said, it was seen as being connected to elections. And what we've now realized is that elections is just one blip, upward blip. And there are many such happening all the time, including COVID-19. A study that we did about in May, June this year, we looked at about 178 fact checks we had done on boomlive.in. And it showed that, and this is the time, as you know, COVID was at its peak and lockdown was at its peak. A lot of the misinformation actually switched from COVID-19 to focusing on the alleged perpetrators or the alleged distributors of that disease, being the Tablighi sect and those who were in Delhi at that time. So, and this was a massive chunk of misinformation that went on for quite a bit of time. So much so that it was the part about the medical or the scientific part was even misinformation or information was overwhelmed and superseded in a way in the social streams by these people who allegedly brought this disease to India. So this is the nature in which it has progressed and it continues to disseminate. Now, the last couple of points that I'd quickly make is that all of this could not have happened obviously without technology. Technology changes the very scale of distribution and dissemination at a level which we've never seen before in life. And literally, I mean that. At no point in history would we have had the ability to put something out and it reaches potentially 10 million, 20 million, 30 million people in days or weeks, or sometimes even hours, depending on who the person is. So therefore, the responsibility of responding to this also lies to some extent with those platforms where this content is either created or distributed. Now, the people create the content just like people use guns to shoot other people, and guns don't shoot people. And therefore, people should be held responsible. But platforms have to bear their share of blame as well. And different countries have approached this differently, and that's really getting into the legal aspect, which I'm obviously going to hand over to Chander. I'll conclude by saying one or two things. One is that this is a demand and a supply problem. What I've spoken about really, and the work that people like us are doing, is on the supply side, which is to say that how do you try and push back at these reams or mountains of misinformation and fake news across areas. Could be communal and social, communal, social, and political, health and medicine, finance, business, even history. All of this flowing towards you. And what do you do about it? Do you push back at the few people who distribute it? And we've had some success at that when we could identify them. Or do you keep the volume of response so high that over time people begin to understand that, you should not trust anything and therefore be careful? The other side is the demand side, which is actually something that we all need to be more aware of and could and should work towards. So for instance, as small pilots, we've been running in Mumbai, we've been going to schools, this is pre-COVID, and doing 1.5 2 hour capsule or sessions where we do quizzes and we engage young children to say, do you know this is fake? Do you know this is not fake? This is true. And therefore, focusing on the very fundamental aspect, which is the internet itself, and how do you engage with the internet in a manner that you can be more self-aware. And eventually, it's also clear to us that unless we address this problem on the demand side, which is to improve the quality of education, improve the quality of digital literacy. Like I said, digital literacy is not the same as literacy. To appreciate and understand that something that comes on a WhatsApp or some other platform may not be the truth also takes a certain degree of comprehension, and that takes time. So, and maybe it's a process of evolution. So, I mean, focusing on digital literacy, and finally, as you get older, the importance of critical thinking. So you may start young, but I think as you can see in all the WhatsApp groups that you're part of, there is a lack of critical thinking or evident lack of critical thinking in the content that's forwarded to you, right? People are not questioning enough. So is that something more cultural? Is that something that we have to go back in history? I don't know, but it's something that we can clearly work on, and it's never too late to do that. So I'm going to pause on that at that point and hand it over to Chander for his thoughts, and really looking at how we can approach this from a legal and maybe a judicial sense. Thanks. Thank you, and over to you, Chander.
Thanks, Govind. That was very, very illuminating. Actually, I must just to add, though, this is really Govind's speciality, because apart from being a television journalist and a journalist in all spheres, he has been associated with Boom and with factchecker.in, both of which are specifically aimed at rooting out fake news. So you couldn't have a better specialist, or you couldn't have better domain knowledge on this. But Govind chose not to go into a slightly technical sounding thing of the differences, but I would like to just touch on that. The difference between misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and deep fake, because these are going to be of great importance going forward. Because like Govind said, that we have a situation where in 3 or 4 years, something which may have started off, relatively small, has now grown into a gigantic monster that is enveloping the entire world. So just to understand, misinformation is basically incorrect information, but which might be disseminated innocently or might without any actual malicious intent. I get some information, it's incorrect, but I pass it on WhatsApp or Facebook or whatever. It isn't intended to cause any harm to anybody, and that's misinformation. Disinformation is the root the basis on which fake news is built up. Disinformation is misleading information which is manipulated, which is altering the facts, and then with a malicious and a deliberate intent to spread a falsehood in order to achieve some goal. That is disinformation. And fake news, really, as I see it, is disinformation which has been crafted in a manner to mimic genuine news. So you take your disinformation and then you put it in a format where it mimics genuine news, and it makes people believe or feel that what they are getting is genuine news, because it might mimic the platforms, it might mimic the television channels, it might mimic newspaper names, and so on and so forth. And it's crafted with a very, very malicious intention to achieve goals. Goals can be, as Govind said, manipulating elections, or helping particular political parties, or even spreading hatred among against a community, for a community. What happened with the Tablighi Jamaat, for instance, in May and June, is a sort of classic thing, which it doesn't have any any connection with elections, doesn't have any connection with any goal except to distract, to change the narrative that is going on, to distract people from pressing needs and requirements and so on, and to just sort of throw up gorilla dust so that people get distracted completely from what's going on. And what is going to be a huge area of worry, which I'm going to ask Govind to touch upon later, is deep fakes. And deep fakes so far still seem to be on the fringes. But deep fakes are a great source of worry, because these are where you use actual public figures, you use people, and you using technology and algorithms and other things, you make them appear to be saying things that they're not saying. You make them you put words into their mouth, or you take one person and you substitute another person's face on that person. So you might have to put it very crudely, you have a jihadist from the ISIS, and you put the face of an Indian politician on that jihadist, and so and they are so convincing. They're so convincing. You can have, we've seen examples of Boris Johnson speaking as Trump, and Trump speaking as Boris Johnson, and so on. And they're so convincing that nobody would know that it's not that particular person. But this is going into the future, and so I was just highlighting the sort of difference between these various areas. Our problem in India, really, before I come to a few legal, before I highlight a few legal things, is that unlike perhaps what happened in the US elections, unlike what has happened in a lot of other places where Cambridge Analytica and all were complicit or were driving the narrative, most countries seem to face the bulk of the assault on their people was from outside their borders. Our problem in India is that our greatest contribution to fake news is all homegrown. We have now got political parties embracing fake news as though that is the be-all and end-all of politics. And political armies have now set up, political parties have set up armies, cyber armies of trolls, armies of people to twist the cyber narrative and so on. And where it's not homegrown in India, it is by the Indian diaspora. So which is almost like an extension of homegrown fake news, because you have these armies of people sitting in New Jersey, or of Desis sitting in the US, in California, in UK, etc., who are then bombarding our people with the political narratives that are now being used by political parties as their mainstay. And it's not one party or another, it's across the board. Of course, those with deeper pockets, those with more resources are using it to far greater effect and far more maliciously a lot of the time. But I would imagine that most political parties in India have now embraced this entire thing, and they're using it as a regular tool. So this is where we stand. Now I'm going to very briefly touch on the legal aspects, because in our discussions, Govind, I, and Sunita discussed this earlier, and we felt that after a brief introduction by both of us, we would go into a discussion format so that we could focus on certain specific areas. So I'll just give you a very brief overview. India doesn't have presently any really pointed or targeted legal provisions to deal with fake news. The closest that we had was Section 66, capital A, 66A of the Information Technology Act 2000. 66A was, though it preceded the real onset of fake news in when it really became big. But 66A was a provision which could have been used and would have perhaps been used fairly effectively to combat fake news. But what happened was, because it was an overly broad provision and framed in such a manner that it actually tended to completely stifle all dissent and all forms of free speech, the Supreme Court in 2015, in March 2015, struck it down in the famous case of Shreya Singh versus Union of India. Now, one would have imagined that a very trigger-happy government like we have presently would have immediately replaced this with an amendment and brought about a replacement. But obviously, because it is now the political parties themselves who would be the greatest sufferers by any curbs on fake news, because now it's the political parties that are using it. They have, from 2015 till 2020, there's been no move to replace 66A or to bring in a more pointed and less intrusive provision, which would meet the test of the constitutional test of Shreya Singh. So we now have almost complete silence, except by way of some regulations framed under the Information Technology Act. So basically, there are certain provisions in the Information Technology Act which remain, but these are mostly provisions which the government of the day can use and does use, again, only for that fake news or that action which they want to proscribe. Which means that when it is anything that suits their purposes, it doesn't get used. For instance, Section 69A of the Information Technology Act gives the government the power to block content to prevent incitement for commission of a cognizable offense. Now, there are also the Information Technology Procedure and Safeguard for Blocking of Access to Information Rules 2009, which are known broadly as the blocking rules. These do give a certain power to push back to governments, but as I said, they get used very selectively, very infrequently, and only when the government of the day wants to block a particular type of narrative. So, for instance, when the Delhi riots happened in February of this year, there was, right from January, there was a whole lot of WhatsApp groups, messages. There were all kinds of incitements which were going on openly. There was to some extent fake news. Most of it was just hate speech, but there was also fake news. But no blocking was resorted to, no measures were resorted to. There was never any attempt to curb it. Not then, not during the riots, and not after the riots, because it didn't suit anybody's purposes to curb it. So we also have some provisions in the Indian Penal Code which can be used, but they are again used very selectively. For instance, Section 153A, which is promoting of enmity between different groups on the grounds of religion and race, place of birth, etc., etc. This is an offence punishable with imprisonment. Section 295A, which is deliberate and malicious acts to outrage religious feelings of any class of citizens. Section 504, which is an intentional insult with intent to provoke a breach of peace. Section 505, etc. But what we see getting used again is some cartoonist makes a satirical cartoon somewhere, and that will be picked up, and that person will be slammed behind bars because the cartoon is against the chief minister, or the cartoon is against the prime minister, or something of that sort. But where there's really dangerous fake news, as for instance, when in 2017 and 18 you had people were spreading, using WhatsApp groups and others, they were spreading rumors about child lifting. More than 50 people were lynched in 2 years in India, in Assam, in Northeast. At least 24 people came to be lynched. In Maharashtra, on one day, 5 members of a nomadic tribe were lynched as being child lifters. This happened in Karnataka. It happened all over the country. It was entirely generated by fake news. It happened recently in Maharashtra when a group of some 2 sadhus or something were set upon because they went through some back routes, through some tribal villages and so on. The point I'm making is that all these appalling instances have taken place before our very eyes. nothing happens. But one satirical, poem is there, or a satirical song is sung, or a satirical cartoon is set out, and the person is slammed behind bars. So you have the provisions, but you have the provisions which are entirely in the hands of the state, and it's the state's choice whether to invoke those provisions or not. So this is broadly the just a broad bird's eye view of the legal aspects. And I would like to join Govind in what he said about the duty or the responsibility of even people who receive news. I mean, it's very difficult for people to actually sift out the wheat from the chaff. It's very difficult to actually know what is true, what is fake. But we are at a situation where it becomes every citizen's duty, and especially those who are educated, to actually verify, to check, check with fact-checker.in, check with snopes.com, check with altnews.com, check with Boom. All these websites are freely available. They are available online. One would know half the time before forwarding things, etc., what needs to be, what can be done, what needs to be done. There's I think it was a Canadian group which came up with this acronym SIFT, and they said SIFT stands for Stop, Investigate, Find Better Coverage, and Trace Claims. So SIFT is stop first when you get something, investigate the source, then try to find better coverage, and trace claims, quotes, media to the original context in which they were released. We really can and we should, and right now today's audience are all lawyers, law students, young would-be lawyers, people who are interested in the law. So at least all of us, I think, owe it to ourselves and owe it to the next generation also to start actually checking things before we start bouncing them on, and try to stem the rot in whatever small way we can do. Over to you, Govindraj.
Okay, thanks for that, Chander. So there are a lot of questions that have come in, and I think we can use that to kick off our conversation. So Uday Singh asks, how does one account for irresponsible journalism? For instance, the absolute fixation with Riya Chakraborty when we almost came to a war with China. When we almost came to a war, is this not an extension of fake news? Actually, no. A fixation with Riya Chakraborty in itself is not fake news, because that's really let's say a rating strategy followed by channels whose business model is under stress or has been under stress for a while. There are 400 news channels roughly. The amount of advertising is not really going up, and that's rating points are a weekly currency. I've been in television, so I have some idea. So, and typically channels tend to respond to what is most, let's say, exciting, and make the whole process more entertaining, because news audiences also, you have to remember, are very small. I mean, they're only about of the total television pie. No, most of this happens in television, right? So let's say, if the television pie is 100, the news audience within that will be 8 or 9. So if you want more people to watch news, then you have to make it entertaining. And what better way to make it entertaining than to go after a Bollywood character and so on. So there's a direct correlation between your audience growth and the kind of content you do. Now, should that be journalism or not? I think that way, unfortunately, that we passed that point long ago. So then that's a different discussion as well. So would not dissemination of fake news amount to corruption or be an instance of criminal breach? I think this is over to you, Chander.
I don't think dissemination of fake news can be called corruption. It's certainly let's put it this way: if there is if fake news is being used for perverting the electoral process, let's say, it is something which is actually proscribed under the Representation of People Act. But none of that results in rectifying the system, in the sense that once a person is elected, trying to take electoral action against them because they spread fake news, etc., is one, it's an absolutely punishing process. Nothing happens by the time an election petition is heard, 5 years are over, and the term is over, and a fresh election is already called. Two is that fake news is not normally traceable to that particular political party. Most of the time, what happens is that they've spread it all across the globe. They have these, as I said, they have these cyber armies out there. But to actually trace and to pin down and to say that Mr. So-and-so, who is an electoral candidate and so-and-so, has generated this news and this is a corrupt electoral practice or something of that sort, would be exceedingly difficult. Perhaps theoretically, yes, in the context of electoral law, it might amount to a corrupt electoral practice. I don't think it's corruption in the general sense, where we talk about like the Prevention of Corruption Act or something, but it could be a corrupt electoral practice for sure, but one which would be very, very difficult to pin down on a particular candidate.
Just a quick point on, one of the big challenges, even legally, and this is a question that keeps coming up, is how do different countries respond to this? And it is a fact that different countries do respond differently. Democracies are more wary about bringing in full-out legislation against misinformation or fake news, because there is obviously a thin line in some ways between someone's freedom of expression and a state becoming, cracking down on it. And even if that person is saying something wrong or untrue, the person should be allowed to express. This was a subject of some discussion in the United States a few months ago in the run-up to the present elections, where there was a question about whether should Facebook censor advertisements or statements by politicians which were blatantly untrue, even including advertisements. And at that time, Facebook concluded or said that they did not want to, because in a democracy where, assuming all other institutions are working, it's really between a voter and the politician. And voters should be allowed to decide whether that politician is telling the truth or not telling the truth. And if he or she is lying, then they would accordingly, decide for themselves, which of course is a very ideal world, but that's how people look at it. The West European democracies are even more particular about protecting the sense of freedom of speech. But as you look at other countries, Malaysia had a law against fake news enacted, but they pulled it back. I mean, I think it was a draft law; it never became law, but it was pulled back. Singapore has some kind of framework, though I don't think it's a law specifically. So it really depends on the country where you are, and it's really something that the people and their representatives have to decide upon and agree upon what it should be and whether there should be a response to that. So let me see.
Can I just add something there, Govind?
Please.
See, broadly on the legal frameworks that we have, like Singapore, in fact, does have. They've introduced something called the POFMA, the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, and it came into force in 2018, I think. On 2nd October 2019, Gandhi Jayanti, in fact. So they have and it's a very broad, intrusive sort of law, I would say, which wouldn't probably pass muster in most liberal democracies. But Singapore being a sort of a state which has got a fairly tightly controlled form of democracy, which is close to autocracy, they would get away with it. But several countries, including several European and other liberal democracies, have introduced even criminal sanctions for fake news. But interestingly, those sanctions appear to be targeted against foreign players. It's always against foreign players. So, for instance, in 2019, Denmark amended their law to criminalize the dissemination of disinformation that aids or enables a foreign state actor to influence public opinion. Australia has a similar provision. China, Egypt, UAE have, of course, those being far from democracies, they've got very strict provisions, which again they selectively use whenever it suits them against certain people. And you have a wide swathe of countries. Now, what you said about the US, Govind, is that because of the Second Amendment in the United States Constitution, they have an absolute freedom to say whatever you like. I mean, so fake news, to control fake news in the United States is very, very difficult. To control it legislatively or to control it by criminal sanctions is very difficult. You could only sue after the fact. After the event, you could sue people for damages and so on and so forth. Our problem in India is that we are today probably the fake news capital of the world. And I don't know if we are recognizing it, but for instance, in February 2019, Microsoft had done what they call, they did a survey which they call the Digital Civility Index. I love that phrase, civility index, because we wonder sometimes whether civil behavior is even recognized in the world anymore. But their Digital Civility Index, which came out in February 2019, found that out of the 22 countries that they surveyed, Indians were most likely to be recipients of regular doses of fake news as well as internet hoaxes. Both. So on both counts, out of 22 countries, India came out top. So we are probably the fake news capital of the world. And yet, as I said, we have got no law. After 66A has been struck down, we have got no law that deals with it at all, even peripherally, except for takedown orders, which courts can issue or which the government can issue, or internet ban orders, which is like using a blunderbuss, to swat a fly, because you just have internet bans in all of Jammu and Kashmir, all of Assam, all of this, all of that. 10-day ban, 20-day ban, etc. I mean, that's insane, absolutely. But we really do need something. Yes, it has to be nuanced. It cannot. It cannot be a weapon given to political people to stifle dissent, etc., etc. But at the same time, you can't have a complete laissez-faire sort of situation that we have presently.
Okay, Khushbu Jain asks, jurisdiction in the existence of global internet is another crucial aspect I see when it comes to solving of crimes, even if we get proper regulation in place. How do we address issue of enforceability due to jurisdiction? So before I hand over to Chander, largely most misinformation flows through social platforms, and most social platforms are organizations, as you know, many of them, they are listed in America, have large operations across the world, including, of course, in India. So it's in a way easier, and there is culpability, and finally their revenue comes from advertising. So they do have advertising and other technology presence in this country. So if you want to catch someone from one of these organizations and hold them accountable for misinformation flowing through your country, you can do that. I have not seen any of the bigger platforms, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, Google, YouTube, run away from that. They may try and defend it, and that's a different issue, but it's difficult for them to duck that completely, because they are present in your country, at least in our country, in a fairly significant way. So on the legal part, Chander, it's over to you.
I can't really add much to that, Govind, except to say that there are several reported cases from the European Union, for instance, and from individual European countries where they have imposed sanctions against Facebook. They've imposed sanctions against various monetary sanctions as well as other forms. And in the European Union itself, it's happened, and countries like France, etc. There've been cases. So. In Germany, I think there have been some cases. So it's not that because of jurisdictional problems they can escape. I completely join you in that. And recently, very heartening not on the legal front, but on the pushback by advertisers, we've had this very heartening thing where Bajaj Auto and Parle Biscuits and so on said that they're going to pull all their advertising, they're going to stop advertising on platforms which carry, hate. That wasn't really targeted on fake news per se, but hate speech and hate content and generating anti-minority sentiments and so on. And fake news could be a manifestation of that also. So I think that's a pretty positive and heartening development.
Okay, there's another question from Khushbu again. Isn't there a need for a specific law to deal with fake news, also incorporating rumors and defamation? The current laws on fake do exist in IPC and IT Act, but being vague invites ambiguity and gives draconian powers to LEAs.
I think that personally, I'm totally against defamation being a prosecutable offence per se. So I completely disagree with the Indian Supreme Court's view on defamation being a criminal act. I think that's used as a tool to stifle criticism and so on, and it's criminal defamation has been abolished in most of the world, most of the civilized world for sure. The Indian Supreme Court, with its 300-page judgment by Justice Deepak Mishra, surprisingly, in my view, upheld criminal defamation. So I wouldn't advocate having yet another law to deal with defamation in the context of fake news. Yes, I think that we need some pointed sort of laws, but which have to strike a balance between one, citizens' access to action. That means that the action should not be only state-sponsored. There should be some form of where citizens can seek blocking orders, where citizens can seek takedown orders. Today, takedown orders the Indian courts have held that it's only government or the courts that can direct a website or a platform to take down any fake news or any information. A citizen's complaint, even if a citizen writes to the platform and says this is absolutely fake news, it means nothing. They don't have to take it down unless there's a court order. So we probably need something more pointed there. But the delicate balance will always have to be struck. How do you avoid giving state governments and the central government yet another weapon to beat the media with? So to try and cure fake news, you shouldn't end up where they end up killing the messenger altogether.
Okay. Nayan asks, can regulating social media journalism through an independent regulatory body help regulate fake news? So a larger question, media is best self-regulated. I know I have a bias in saying so, but trying to bring any regulation on from the top usually creates more problems than it was meant to solve. Fake news by definition does not spread through media. What I mean when I say that is, even when we studied these over a period of time, barely 3 or 4% of viral content would come from, or fake content would come through mainstream media, and mainstream or organized media, which could include social media. So 95% plus, or 96 and 97% plus, flows through the subterranean chambers and corridors, which is really your WhatsApp and such platforms, where no one outside can see what's going on, and even if they see, there's it's very difficult to find out where the source was or who the source was. So I think this is just best self-regulated. Okay. Satyajit Desai says, more of a suggestion rather than a question. Have a proper law and make the punishment penalty very high in order to dissuade people spreading fake news. Satyajit Desai, senior advocate. Chandar, it's over to you.
Yeah, actually, Satyajit, there are examples of that in several countries, I think, where, for instance, interference with the electoral process has led to very, very large financial liabilities. But the closest example of this is the Singapore law that I mentioned, which is called POFMA, Protection from Online Falsehood and Manipulation Act. Now, that actually has every person who forwards something which is found to be, which violates that act, the individuals in breach of Section 7 will be liable to a fine of up to $50,000 and or a term of imprisonment up to 5 years. For non-individuals, that is online media platforms run by tech companies, a fine of up to $500,000 will be imposed. This is Singapore dollars, of course, but it's still not insubstantial. Alternatively, where a fake online account or bot is used to spread such falsehoods, offenders who are individuals will be liable to a fine of $100,000 and or a term of imprisonment of 10 years. For non-individuals, a fine of up to $1 million will be imposed. Now, all this is, it's all very well, but can you envision, Satyajit, how this is going to play out in our Indian context? Who are the people who are going to ultimately be facing these prosecutions? I mean, somebody like Ravish Kumar of NDTV India, who is been constantly exposing what he calls the WhatsApp University of India, it will probably be the first target. So the guys who are actually fighting against fake news will probably get targeted with this sort of thing. So we really need to get a law, but we need to get serious balance before we do that.
Okay, Homi Kaka asks, would you agree that the protection against action given to platforms such as Facebook increase the occurrence of fake news? Okay, so let me take a first stab at that. I think, full disclosure, we work with Facebook and we fact check posts that have been flagged as false by Facebook users. And I think from our point of view, this is a very rapidly evolving space. So if you go back 13 or 15 years, none of this existed. I mean, when I say none of this, even your iPhone didn't exist. You go back a couple of years back and forth, there was no YouTube, there was no Twitter, and even Facebook as it was in its nascent form was all about, and until quite recently was about sharing pictures from your beach holiday to make other people jealous, or finding friends and classmates and so on. It's only in the last maybe 4, 5 or 6 years that the internet and social platforms have begun to be used for evil, to put it not so finely. And the question now is, are the platforms responding fast enough? I believe that the platforms are responding, fast enough, but maybe their approach, like in many other areas, has been to try and use technology first to fix the problem. And I think that, and that continues to be an issue, and that I think causes a delay. I think recognizing that many of these problems are driven by people and therefore need to be responded by people one way or the other has taken the platform some time. But that's not because they've not tried to respond to it. I think they've also come from a different world. Most platforms, as you know, sit in California, which is, libertarian and, usually the epitome of free market expression and so on. And obviously as their platforms and their propositions have rolled throughout the world, these are different worlds and different cultures and so on. So I think the realization that this sort of libertarian capitalism or free speech will not work everywhere else has taken time. The realization that technology cannot be the fix has taken time. But my sense is that if the problem is there, the solution also has to be there, whether it's to bring in the best engineers in the world, keep working on the artificial intelligence and the machine learning to keep catching it. Even today, the top platforms would eliminate 70-80% of misinformation even before it reaches, let's say, the public eye, by catching it at inception or catching it when accounts are being formed and so on. But this is an ongoing battle. And a lot of these battles, for instance, are not fought within the country, but America, for instance, is quite openly fighting against what they say is infiltration attempts from Russian hackers and Chinese hackers and so on. Europe is also, and including framing laws, is fighting external threats rather than internal, and we have a slightly different problem. So I would say it's work in progress. I think it's important that people like us keep the pressure on platforms to keep evolving, whether from a technology point of view, technology policy point of view, or bringing in the right amount of human interface and response to this problem. And that will hopefully solve some of the problem. But The larger solution, like I mentioned in the beginning, will also come by focusing on the demand side, which is something that's but maybe tougher, but that's really where the real effort needs to be put in. Chander, it's over to you.
Govind, can I ask you a follow-up question to this one?
Yeah.
Now your like Boom and FactChecker.in, etc. You have partnerships sometimes with some of the platforms like maybe with Facebook or with WhatsApp, etc. to do fact checking for them.
Yeah.
Now, how long does it take typically for your team to fact check one piece of fake news? If there's a video or something, how long does it take to check that and to find out, to trace it all the way back, etc.?
Yeah, so Boom mostly works on that. Fact Checker focuses on statements made by people in public life. So there it's fairly, I mean, it may take longer because it's looking at government data to, either correct or even maybe reiterate. In the case of Boom, by the way, India has perhaps the highest amount of video misinformation. Since you mentioned video, it's much higher. I mean, India has the highest proportion of, at least amongst the medium to large countries, misinformation flowing via video as opposed to any other form or format. So it could take us a couple of hours. Sometimes it could take us minutes to respond because we've already done something in that space, and we just put out something immediately saying here's a fast check, and we put it on our Twitter, Facebook, if you're creating a video, then on YouTube, and then on the website, of course. In some cases,
once you reveal it to be fake, do they take it down or do they put a disclaimer or what?
So our partnership is only with Facebook. If we put a strike on a piece of content, Facebook suppresses its distribution. So that can typically, and particularly if you're a media organization, then most media organizations get in touch with us immediately and correct it, and then ask us to remove the strike, which we do. But if it's some individual who's done it, then it's a little different because we've clearly called that person out, and basically. If your website, if your page or your profile exists for some kind of commercial reasons, then usually you would be careful on Facebook as well. But yeah, we've seen people do it, and when Facebook suppresses, so Facebook doesn't remove the piece of content; it just suppresses the distribution. But that suppression is significant. So the work we do has sort of a multiplier effect of sorts. I mean, we are a small organization, but because we are able to fact check on Facebook, the multiplier effect is much higher. So that's to come back to your question. I think it could take, like I said, a few minutes. It could take a couple of hours, but in some cases it might take days. Because so the thing about our kind of response is we always physically respond. We, for instance, if there's a photograph saying, "Oh, here is a shooting taking place in Guwahati." Or here is something that has happened in Srinagar or in Chennai. We would typically get in touch with, let's say, the Superintendent of Police for Chennai city or maybe Srinagar or Guwahati, and then check with them. So we always check with police, and most local police, at least the major cities or the states know that we exist. Or it could be if it is an misattribution or alleged misattribution of a statement, we would get in touch with that person. So that's what takes time. It could take, like I said, anywhere between minutes to a couple of hours. Hours is usually the median, but in some cases it may take even a day or two.
Thank you.
It's all physical. Okay, let me pick up another question. Okay, Natasha Daswani asks, what is the right course of action when one comes across fake news that is potentially either furthering a political propaganda by spreading disinformation or furthering a media trial? I don't know. This is very tough to say. I mean, if you're sure that it's misinformation and it's also furthering political propaganda, which a lot of it is, then the best is to ensure that you don't forward it further. And if you're sure that it's fake or you want to get it checked, you can always send it to us. We have a WhatsApp helpline, and where we pick up things that are being, shared, and we're tracking it. I mean, it's a pretty, I would say, almost 18 to 19 by 7 operation. The number is 7700906111. So you can use, and we have actually 2 helplines. Let me give you the other number as well. It's 7700906588. Actually, this is the number you should keep. It's 7700906588. So anything that you see, just forward it to this helpline, and it's very likely that we will see it at some point. And if it's something that we can, then we'll respond to. We'll work on it, and then we'll respond to it. Okay, Natasha, again, is it feasible to ensure some amount of advertisers' liability for the content that is shared on the channels that they promote themselves on? Chander?
I don't know how you would apportion blame, how you would arrive at liabilities, etc. We really need to have a community pushback. Like I said about Bajaj Auto and Parle product. In a lot of for instance, apartheid in South Africa, the boycotts took years and years and years to achieve, but ultimately boycotts of companies and that were dealing in South Africa, boycotts in Europe, boycotts in the US of companies that were trading with South Africa, ultimately had their effect in South Africa. There can be arguments this way and that, but the point is that getting legal sanctions against advertisers, against people would be very difficult to get liabilities assigned. But if we as consumers were to reach out to companies and make it clear that why the hell are you, I'm going to stop buying your products, why are you advertising and so, maybe that kind of movement can pick up. And especially, even with endorsers, like the big cricket players, the film stars, etc., endorsing things on these, fake news, on the very same fake news channels or whatever. So somewhere there has to be a kind of a pushback. But I think a community pushback probably might in the over a period of time be more effective.
Okay, Rajni Iyer asks, censorship versus regulations, who decides?
Who decides? Censorship and regulation are actually really two sides of the same coin. So I really don't know. The question really here is whether it's censorship or regulation. Both ways. The real tricky part is the balance between freedom of expression, freedom of the press, the freedom to dissent, etc., and the need to curb this absolute scourge, this menace of fake news. It's a really tough one. There are no easy answers to that, and certainly not something that we'll be able to give in a few minutes. But Rajni is an old friend, and I'll be really happy to sit down and chat and discuss this with her at great length. And actually, I'll have to pick her brains on this and get all the information out of Rajni.
Okay, Uday Singh asks, how would one deal with a situation where a fact-checking institution is pressurized to stop investigating an inconvenient truth? Who would police the police? So it's an excellent question, and we do get asked this all the time. The concept of fact-checking and the institutional approach to it is only a few years old now. There is an international fact-checking network, IFCN, which sits under the Poynter Institute out of the United States, which currently has created a body of certification. And this body does an annual certification, and it also, as part of its diligence, looks at the kind of work that you did, and you have to show instances of non-bias, the fact that you're doing, let's say, fact checks which may go against the government, and maybe in favor of, so to show your neutrality or bias. So that's a more larger thing. But if you are pressurized to stop doing something on a specific issue, and that doesn't come out, it's tough to know. But my sense is that over time, if you, let's say, play with people's faith in you, usually at some point it catches up. I can just say that as a journalist. I think, I'm a journalist, and I tend to approach these things from a slightly more longer term point of view. That, journalistic integrity is something which is, it's almost like an eggshell. You have to protect it very carefully. And if you play with it and compromise it and, don't stand up to the highest principles, at some point it catches up. It's a very idealistic answer to give, but at the end of all of this, or at the beginning, all of this is idealism. I mean, we wouldn't have, or I wouldn't have started all this if I didn't believe idealistically in what I'm doing. Chander.
I can't add anything to that.
Okay, I think we're coming to the end of the conversation. So, Chander, let me ask you, I mean, a couple of questions from my side. When you, when you look at the legal framework and environment today, how conducive do you think it is for people to get justice in the context of media? As in, let's say media itself is becoming an arbitrator, and it's trying to, in many cases, as we've seen. When there is a clear division of media between, let's say, or there are media itself begins to sort of reflect or parrot what a government, it may be a local government or a federal government or whatever. So what's the legal recourse, if any? I mean, media finally, at least social media may not be so well governed, but television is governed. I mean, there are licenses given by the Information and Broadcasting Ministry. The print industry is governed similarly, not by a license, but there is a registrar of newspapers and so on. So there is some framework under which it exists. So therefore, equally, what is the legal recourse that people have if they feel that a system is not as clean as it should be or is not delivering?
Well, it's for the individual. I mean, it's very difficult because the legal system in India, unfortunately, runs really, really slow, and so the real problem is that if somebody's reputation has been tarnished, if somebody's take a case where there's a media trial, and let's say it's based entirely on fake news. If people get suspended from their jobs, if people lose their jobs, etc., that doesn't come back, and they spend the next several months just trying to clear their names. Now, for instance, fake news has been used to target certain people, especially a lot of liberal voices. There are people who are today languishing in jails and all under really specious charges. Everybody knows that they're going to walk at the end of the day. But the media has hounded them, treated them as criminals. Sometimes it even begins with media, as one of the questioners asked about Riya Chakravarti and all. Of course, that wasn't strictly on the subject of fake news. And we can't go into all that today. But the tragedy really is that even if you have, for instance, say criminal defamation is on the statute books, much as I might disagree with it. Criminal defamation is a very potent weapon to be used, but it can only be used by people of means, people where there's a company that is defamed, or there's somebody who's got deep pockets who's defamed. They can take action against it. They can hire the best lawyers. They can pursue the matter, etc. What happens with ordinary people who lose their jobs, whose lives get sort of torn apart due to fake news? For them to get redress is very difficult, and primarily because our legal system is just very, very, very agonizingly slow.
Right, Chander, thank you so much.
Thank you, Govind, for being on the platform with you.
No, my pleasure and honor. Thank you so much.